Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
My parents gave my brothers everything while constantly reminding me, in words and in actions, that I was nothing special. And for a long time I believed them because when you are a kid and every adult in your life repeats the same message, you stop questioning whether it is true and instead you simply carry it like a fact carved into your skin. I remember how my oldest brother, Daniel, got his first car before he even had a license, a shiny gift wrapped in bows and pride, while I was told to be grateful for the second-hand bike I could use to get to my part-time job after school. When my younger brother, Mark, wanted to try out sports, there was a check ready for uniforms, gear, and travel. And when I asked about joining a riding camp, the answer was that I should not expect them to waste money on silly hobbies that would never take me anywhere. Over and over it felt like the world inside our house had been divided into winners and extras, and I was cast in the role of the extra. I tried to be the good daughter, to swallow the hurt and keep smiling, but it wore on me in ways I didn't even recognize at first. Birthdays came and went with big family dinners for my brothers, cakes that had their favorite themes, and stacks of wrapped boxes at the table, while mine were acknowledged with a quick happy birthday and maybe a $20 bill slipped into my hand like an afterthought. I still remember being 15 and sitting at the table while everyone clapped for Daniel's new car keys, and then looking at my own plate and realizing no one had even gotten me a card. That was the first time I excused myself early, locked myself in my room, and cried until I was too drained to move. The funny thing is that favoritism doesn't just show up in big gestures, it shows up in the daily grind too. When I cleaned, it was expected. When I helped with bills by working after school, it was brushed off as my responsibility. But when Daniel filled the dishwasher once, my mom made a show of thanking him like he had saved the household, and when Mark mowed the lawn, my dad told him he was such a man already. I could have solved their problems, cooked their meals, carried their emotional weight, and it would not have changed the fact that in their eyes I was filler, someone destined to fade behind my brothers' lives. At some point, though, I realized that their constant dismissal had shaped me into someone who was not going to sit quietly forever. I remember standing in the kitchen one night when my mother said, "You should just accept that not everyone is cut out for great things, and that's okay. You'll find your place someday." And instead of nodding or pretending not to care, I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't rage exactly, and it wasn't sadness either. It was clarity. I finally understood that nothing I did was ever going to change their minds. They had decided I was small, and no matter what I achieved or how hard I worked, in their story I would always be the one who didn't measure up. That clarity was like stepping out of a fog, and it forced me to see just how much I had been wasting my energy trying to earn scraps of approval that were never going to come. The next time my dad bragged about how Daniel was applying to expensive colleges and joked that I would probably end up staying close to home because it would be safer for you, I laughed. I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I just laughed because it was the moment I understood I could stop begging them to see me. Of course, I wasn't ready to cut them off right then. I was still young, still tied to that house by money I didn't have and fear of what would happen if I tried to stand alone. But I began to pull back. I stopped sharing things with them because why give people ammunition to mock me with? I stopped asking for things because why keep proving their point that I was dependent? I started saving quietly, planning quietly, and telling myself that one day I would walk away and never come back unless I chose to. What hurt the most was not even their treatment, but how normal it felt, how I caught myself expecting nothing and thinking that was fine. When my friends asked what I got for Christmas, I made up stories because it was easier than admitting I had received socks while my brothers got laptops. When teachers praised me for grades or projects, I downplayed it because I knew at home it wouldn't matter. Somewhere along the line I had taught myself to dim my own light because shining didn't get me attention, it only got me reminders that I was nothing special. But the thing about carrying a label like that is that eventually you get tired of holding it. I was reaching that point where I had two choices: keep living inside the box they built for me, or tear the box apart and build something of my own even if it meant starting with nothing but my own determination. And one night, sitting on my bed after another family dinner where I might as well have been invisible, I made a silent promise to myself that I would not keep playing their game. I didn't say it out loud, and I didn't write it down, but in my mind I repeated the words like a mantra. I am done. Done waiting, done begging, done accepting that this is all my life gets to be. I would walk away, and I would prove them wrong without ever needing their approval. They didn't know it yet, but that was the last year I let them decide who I was. And when I finally left, the silence I gave them would speak louder than anything they had ever said to me. Leaving that house did not happen in a burst of drama or a screaming match that ended with a slammed door. It happened the way most real changes do, slowly and deliberately and in the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts again. So I started by collecting essentials that no one had cared about before but suddenly mattered more than any apology I would never get, like my birth certificate, my social security card, my tax records, and the little spiral notebook where I kept a running list of passwords and due dates and dollar amounts I owed or was owed, and then I built a simple plan that did not require anyone's blessing, which meant finding a cheap apartment with a month-to-month lease, picking up extra shifts at work without telling anyone, and paying cash for a used laptop so no one could argue it was theirs. I packed in stages because it was easier to carry 2 bags at a time down 2 flights of stairs than to invite a family intervention, and I told no one except the landlord and myself, because I had learned the hard way that the fastest way to kill your momentum is to announce it to people who are invested in you staying exactly where they put you. The call started the day after I changed my address, and they came wrapped in that same tone my mother has used my entire life, the one that pretends concern but is really control with a ribbon on top. And she said that family is everything and that I could not just cut ties over a few misunderstandings, and my father chimed in with advice about budgeting as if I had not been budgeting for years while my brothers played with the gifts he kept calling investments. And then Daniel sent a long text about how independence is harder than it looks, and he just did not want me to embarrass myself by failing in public, as if embarrassment could compete with the weight of being ignored in your own kitchen. I let the messages pile up and I did not respond, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I had finally admitted to myself that answering them meant reopening a wound they never believed they made. So I did the only respectful thing I could do for both of us, and I gave them silence. Silence, as it turns out, is not passive when you use it to build something, and mine was busy, full of small choices that made a different life possible. So I got a second job on weekends. I learned to make one grocery run stretch 2 weeks. I took the bus instead of the ride Daniel offered with strings attached, and every time I doubted myself, I reminded the shaking part of me that being uncomfortable in my own place still felt better than being comfortable in a place where I was always the extra. I set up my own phone plan and ported my number so there would be no more threats about cutting off service if I did not show up for a family dinner. I opened a bank account in a different institution and moved the paycheck I earned without a penny of their help. I closed the old joint account my mother had convinced me to keep for emergencies after I traced the withdrawals and realized most of those emergencies had a familiar set of names attached to them, and then I put a hold on my credit with all 3 bureaus because I knew exactly how creative they could get when someone needed a cosigner, and the golden boys were tapped out. About a week later, a dealership called to confirm my consent to back Daniel's low-interest loan for a new truck he did not need, and I let the salesman finish his friendly script before I told him calmly that I had not authorized anything, that my credit was frozen, and that any application with my name on it should be considered attempted fraud. And the poor man apologized and hung up in a hurry that said he had just realized he stepped into a family mess he did not want to be part of. And I stood in my tiny kitchen and laughed in a way that did not feel petty but felt clean, because for once a decision I made protected me before I even knew I needed protection. The next wave hit when my parents showed up unannounced at my apartment with a gift bag and a speech about starting over, and they tried to handle like it had ever been their right to do so. And I let them knock while I stood on the other side of the door, breathing steadily and reminding myself that boundaries are not walls against love, they are guardrails against harm. So I texted a single message that explained in plain terms how future communication would work, which was that I would not take surprise visits, I would not answer calls after a certain hour, and I would not discuss money under any circumstances. And they replied with a flurry of guilt wrapped as love, but I did not open the door. Because a boundary is only a line if you keep walking back over it to be nice. Then came the part that some people will call petty and I will call necessary, because when I pulled a copy of the joint account statements and saw several charges marked as family purchases that I had never agreed to, I made an itemized list with dates and amounts and who benefited, and I wrote a brief letter in simple language that said I was closing the account, that future access was revoked, and that any attempt to open credit in my name would be met with a police report and a fraud affidavit. And I sent it certified because I had learned to stop leaving room for "we never got it," and when the receipts showed delivered, I put everything in a folder labeled "Peace of Mind" and dropped it in my drawer like a small trophy no one could display but me. That night, Daniel called from a new number and left a voicemail that started with bravado and slid into a plea, and instead of calling back, I forwarded the message to my email and saved it with the rest. Not because I wanted a case file, but because I finally understood that I did not owe anyone forgiveness on their schedule, and if that looked cold to people who had never spent a day being the extra, then so be it. Because I was building a life where my value did not require a family vote. The next morning there was a crisp envelope under my door from the property manager confirming that only my name could authorize entry and that any attempt to use a spare key would be treated as trespassing. And as I read it, I felt the kind of relief that slips in when you have done the unglamorous, boring, grown-up work of protecting yourself, which is the kind of work no one applauds because it is quiet and responsible and steady. And yet it is the foundation under every bolder move that comes later. So when my parents finally realized they could not pressure me in person and could not use my name to patch the holes in my brother's plans, they switched tactics and sent a group text about a family meeting to clear the air. And I answered with a short line that laid out a time, a neutral location, and a requirement that there would be no money talk at all. And when they replied with a nervous, "Of course not," I put my phone face down and let the silence do what it does best, because the small revenge I had delivered without raising my voice had already landed. Their favorite tool was gone, and the next move would be on my terms entirely. Becoming somebody did not feel like one big break that fell out of the sky with a ribbon and applause. It felt like a chain of stubborn choices that I kept making even when no one noticed. So I learned the kind of skills people pay for even if they pretend not to respect them. Things like building simple systems that keep small businesses from drowning in late invoices and inventory mistakes. And I took community classes after work where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the coffee tasted burnt. But the lectures on contracts and bookkeeping and client retention made more sense to me than any speech about family loyalty ever had, and when I finally had enough confidence to pitch myself, I started with the kind of clients who live by referrals and trust. The salon owner who could not track color orders, the contractor who lost money every time a crew miscounted materials, the bakery that kept running out of the items that sold by noon while overbaking the ones that never moved, and I promised them I would fix problems without drama and leave a clean trail of numbers they could follow even on their worst days. I set quiet rules and stuck to them because rules protect you when pressure shows up with a smile, so I wrote simple agreements in plain language that spelled out scope and payment terms and late fees that were firm but fair. I opened a separate account for taxes so I would not lie to myself about what was already spent. I kept every receipt in a scanned folder labeled by month, so there would be no mystery later. And I said no to underpriced work because I had promised the scared version of myself that I would stop treating my time like a favor, and little by little the calls started to come from people who had heard that I did good work and kept my word. And the first time a client asked me to bring on a second consultant, I swallowed the urge to minimize and said I could handle it. Then I hired a part-time assistant whose strengths were different from mine and paid her on time every single time because I wanted to build the kind of company I had needed when I was invisible. When revenue finally reached that phrase people love to throw around at holiday tables, the one about 6 figures that sounds flashy until you understand it means expenses and payroll and taxes and risk, I did not run to buy anything loud or shiny. I bought a reliable used car in my own name with no cosigner, and I paid for professional liability insurance and a trademark filing for my company name that I chose precisely because it did not sound like a family legacy, and then I rented a small office in a building where no one knew my last name or my history. And the first morning I unlocked the door and saw my logo on the wall, I stood in the empty room and let myself feel proud for a full messy minute before I got back to work, because pride is healthy when it is built on receipts rather than on someone else's credit. The strange part was how quickly the people who once called me nothing special learned to speak fluent nostalgia. Because out of nowhere, a cousin sent me a screenshot of my mother commenting on a community page about how she had always known I was a natural organizer and how she had spent years encouraging my business dreams. And then my father posted a photo from some old weekend where I had helped him sort garage clutter and added a caption about how I used to be his unpaid apprentice, and it was almost funny until I saw messages from a vendor congratulating me on my strong family backing and offering extended terms because of my father's good standing. At which point I stopped laughing, because a lie can cost real money when a contract leans on it. I drafted a calm statement for my website's about page that thanked mentors and named the women and men who actually opened doors for me while carefully omitting my parents. And I added one clean line that said my company had no family ownership or guarantors of any kind, so that anyone who wanted to trade on my last name would have to do it without a single link to support the claim. And then I called an attorney who specialized in small business nonsense and paid for an hour to walk through my options, and she suggested a polite but pointed letter reminding certain relatives and their friends that misrepresenting affiliation for personal gain is not a family story, it is business interference. So we prepared 2 short letters on professional letterhead, one addressed to my parents and one to the dealership that had called earlier in the year. And each letter requested immediate correction of any public statements implying financial support or authority over my company. I sent the letters by certified mail because lessons only stick when they come with proof, and while they traveled, I made one choice that people will call petty until they understand how it feels to be erased and then claimed, which was to sponsor a tiny annual microgrant in my county for young women who are told they are nothing special. A no-fuss application with a promise that the selection committee would be teachers and small business owners, and a nurse practitioner who mentored me when I was new, and I named it with my company brand rather than my family name, because the whole point was to show that the story you inherit does not get to be the only story you live. When the delivery receipts hit my inbox, the responses landed right on schedule. First came the brisk text from my father about how lawyers ruin families and how a simple conversation could have solved this. Then the breathy voicemail from my mother about how she had only been proud and never meant harm. Then a message from Daniel accusing me of humiliating them in front of people who matter. And I let all of it sit while I reviewed a new contract from a regional client whose operations director cared only about results, because there is a freedom in discovering that the work you do can be louder than the noise you did not invite. That night, after I signed the contract and filed the scan where it belonged, another screenshot arrived from that same cousin, this time a photo of my parents at a dinner table raising glasses while the caption bragged that our family builds winners and supports our own. And the tag included my business handle as if they had been there on moving day or on any of the long nights I kept my clients alive by fixing their numbers before dawn. And I stared at the screen and felt a wave of heat that was not rage so much as resolve, because I had already learned that boundaries mean little without consequences, which is why I forwarded the screenshot to my attorney with a one-line note authorizing her to send the cease and desist she had drafted as a backup. And as I hit send, my phone flashed with an incoming call from an unknown number that turned out to be my mother asking for a meeting because there was something important I needed to hear, which is exactly when I smiled to myself and set the time on my terms, since the next conversation would happen in a room where neither nostalgia nor guilt could buy a single inch of ground. By the time the call shifted from lecturing to pleading, the tone was so familiar I could have recited it word for word, only now the urgency had nothing to do with family unity and everything to do with bills that would not wait, debts that had matured into lawsuits, and a reputation that had started to fray once the people who used to brag about our last name realized it could not be traded for credit anymore. So when my mother said we should meet and clear the air, I agreed on my terms and chose a neutral room at the credit union where I kept my business accounts, a place with glass walls and a notary on duty and zero tolerance for theatrics, and I arrived early with a slim briefcase that held nothing sentimental, just paper, ink, and the kind of preparation that makes guilt trips melt on contact. They came in together wearing that mix of injured pride and forced warmth that has always been their opening act, my father leading with a speech about how families prosper when they pool resources, Daniel trying a joke about how I must be rich now and could coach him on entrepreneur moves, and Mark performing the part of the reasonable brother who just wants peace. And I let them talk themselves tired before I slid the folder to the center of the table and said we would be discussing facts, not feelings, and that any conversation about money would happen only after some basic housekeeping that should have been done years ago. The first document was plain to the point of boring, a simple affidavit in which each of them would state that they had no ownership, influence, or authority in my company, that they would stop using my name in any context that implied partnership or guarantor status, and that any future representation would require written permission on letterhead. And I watched their faces go from confused to offended as if I had just accused them of robbery, even though the dealership call, the tagged posts, and the whispered boasts about family backing were all sitting in the exhibits behind that affidavit like patient witnesses waiting to be called. So I kept my voice steady and said the notary down the hall would stamp each signature and that this was not a negotiation, because the fastest way to end a lie is to starve it of oxygen and replace it with something official enough to survive memory games. The second packet was a cease and desist drafted in simple language that even a tired banker could skim and understand, one addressed to my parents and one addressed to each brother, politely reminding them that misrepresenting affiliation for personal advantage is not a private story, but a business problem with consequences. And while Daniel started to bluster about how I was overreacting and how this was a family matter, I opened a smaller envelope and showed the certified mail receipts, proving that a first copy had already been delivered the week before, because I had learned that boundaries without teeth invite debate, and I was done debating whether I was allowed to protect what I built. Then came the part that made my father sit back like someone had pulled his chair a few inches away from the table, because I placed a tidy printout listing dates, amounts, and the specific charges that had flowed through the old account my mother loved to call our safety net, and beside it I laid a one-page acknowledgement that simply asked each person to confirm the withdrawals they had made without my consent, not to shackle them with shame, but to replace years of slippery explanations with a single verified ledger, and I explained that I was not pursuing reimbursement for the past as long as the acknowledgement was signed today and followed by two immediate actions. The first being that they would close any credit lines where my name might still lurk as an emergency contact or an authorized user, and the second being that they would remove every public post or caption that implied shared ownership of my success. Because peace without clarity is a truce that expires at the first hint of hunger. My mother tried the soft approach with a tremble in her voice about how this all felt cold and how a hug would fix more than signatures ever could. And I answered that a hug does not void a loan application and that the only way forward was through the documents in front of us. Then I added something I knew they would not expect, which was that I had brought an option that could help them save face without me wiring a single dollar to anyone's account, a structured plan that would give them a pathway back into my life that did not involve handouts, but did involve accountability, and I pushed across a thin stack labeled very plainly as a reconnection agreement, which offered limited contact on a schedule we could all live with and a one-time stipend for my parents that would be paid directly to their utilities for a handful of months, with the condition that my brothers would provide proof of enrollment in basic financial counseling and would spend a set number of Saturdays assisting at the small business clinic that had given me my start, because if they wanted my time, they would have to invest in the kind of community I had turned to when my own house did not open the door. Daniel barked that this was humiliating, and Mark muttered that I was making a spectacle out of our private struggles, and my father said lawyers were poisoning me and that if I really cared I would simply write checks and let the men fix the rest. And while they performed, I opened my briefcase one more time and set down a sealed envelope addressed to both of my parents with a one-line note that said "Final step," and before anyone could ask what was inside, I said we would sign the affidavits, we would notarize them, we would initial the acknowledgement, and only then would I open the envelope and give them my answer to their request to come back into my life. which is the moment their voices finally fell silent because they understood that I had walked in not to be cornered, but to set terms, and as the notary's stamp thudded like a small gavel on the first page, I slid the envelope a few inches closer and watched the three of them reach for it with the same mixture of dread and hope. That? I used to feel at our family table, only this time the hand that would decide when it opened was mine. They finished signing with the stiff hands of people who know on some level that the pen they are holding is also a mirror. The notary stamped the last page with a modest thud that felt like a door settling into its hinges, and I drew the sealed envelope toward me, letting the pause stretch just long enough for them to understand that what I was about to open was not a performance or a plea, but the final step of a plan built in quiet hours when no one gave me credit for being able to plan anything at all. Then I broke the seal and laid 3 letters on the table, saying that each one answered a different part of what they said they wanted and a more important part of what I needed to live without looking over my shoulder. The first letter was a certified copy of my name change with a neat 1-page notice to the agencies and institutions that make up the dull architecture of an adult life, and I said, without heat, that beginning this day every contract, account, filing, and award would carry only the name I chose, that any message addressed to the old surname would sit unanswered because I was done being summoned by a history that did not protect me, and that my emergency contacts, medical forms, and corporate registries were already updated to reflect a truth they had refused to speak, which was that the only people who get to claim me are the people who show up without a price tag attached to their affection. The second letter was addressed to the credit union, and it confirmed the stipends I had mentioned. A narrow bridge of help routed directly to utilities in my parents' names for a specific stretch of months, with no cash changing hands and no favors to repay. And I explained in simple, even language that the bridge would remain only if the terms we had just signed were honored without creative interpretation, that I would not discuss money by text or over dinner, that any surprise visit would end at the threshold, and that any attempt to slide my name under a loan or a promise would cancel the stipends the moment it surfaced, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I had learned the difference between support and surrender. The third letter carried no money and no apology, only dates, addresses, and a plain expectation that could not be purchased. It announced the first cycle of the micro-grant I funded for girls who are told they are nothing special, and the schedule for the free clinic where small businesses learn the unglamorous math that keeps their lights on. And it said that if my brothers wanted time with me, they could show up on the Saturdays listed to lift tables, carry boxes, run sign-in sheets, and sit through the budgeting session without rolling their eyes, because if they wanted the relationship they kept describing, they would have to join the work that built the life they suddenly admired. And that the people who would see them doing it would not be bankers or old friends, but the same owners and clerks and students who had once opened doors for me when my own family would not. They stared with the blankness people wear when the script they wrote in their heads stops matching the scene in front of them, and then the chorus arrived right on cue, my father insisting this was theatrical and unnecessary, and that families solve problems at home. My mother pleading that a hug could do more than paperwork, and that she had only ever bragged because she was proud. Daniel muttering about humiliation and hoops, while Mark asked in a smaller voice whether I really believed they could change, and I answered without raising mine that the affidavits we had signed were not an attack, but a boundary put in ink, that the acknowledgments were not a sentence, but a clean ledger that kept us honest, and that the cease and desist letters were not a threat, but a lock on a door they kept jiggling whenever someone asked them how they were connected to my work. My mother asked whether this meant the doors to my home were closed for good, whether she would ever sit at my table again, whether birthdays would always feel like the year I left, and I told her the doors were not closed. They were simply fitted with hinges that only respect could move, that after one full year of measured contact without a single financial ask or a single public claim to my success, I would be glad to host a dinner where we could try again. And that if the year broke under the weight of old habits, we would simply reset the clock without drama or speeches, because the only way to build something that lasts is to stop pretending that apologies repair concrete when only new forms and new pores ever will. Before we stood, I slid a final sheet across the table, a one-page standing instruction authorizing my attorney to file an injunction without further notice the next time my name appeared as anyone's guarantor or partner or borrowed reputation. And I said that the instruction was already on file and that the motion would move whether I was on a plane or in a meeting or asleep, not because I was spoiling for a fight, but because I wanted peace that did not depend on me being vigilant every hour. And my father bristled at the word injunction like it was a slur, but I reminded him that dignity is quiet until it needs a microphone, and then it speaks in documents. We stood, the notary gathered her stamps, the glass door hushed open, and for a long breath none of us moved because the old choreography had ended and the new one had not yet been learned. So I broke the pause by saying thank you for signing and that I would email the clinic schedule along with the award night details, that the utility credits would begin the following week and end without drama after the last month listed, and that my phone would remain open to messages that sounded like grown people doing grown work, and as I watched their faces I saw my mother hold the envelope with both hands like a fragile thing. Mark nod, as if he had heard at least one sentence he could live by. Daniel grind his jaw because no one had taught him how to show up without swagger, and my father chose silence over a speech for the first time since I can remember. I walked them out and felt something I had not felt since the day I kept my own keys. Not triumph over them, but triumph over the version of me who thought her only choices were to fund the circus or burn the tent. Because I had chosen the third option that almost no one believes exists until they see it on paper, which is to rewrite the rules and enforce them without rage, to offer a path without offering myself up, to answer the knock without handing over the house. And as the door eased back into place, I knew I had given them exactly what they never expected, neither a slammed door nor an open wallet, but a doorway with rules written in letters anyone can read and a path they could walk or refuse. They had hoped for mercy that looked like a blank check or punishment that confirmed the story they tell about me being cold, and they got neither. They got a hand that pointed toward work and a year that could earn dinner. And I got the ending I promised myself on the night I whispered that I was done, because I left the door open, not for a demand or a performance, but for the kind of family you build with accountability and respect. And if they never walk through it, the people who already treat me like I matter will keep filling the room. The clinic will still run on those Saturdays, the grant will still land in the hands that need it, and the story that used to make me small will end exactly where my signature says it does, which is to say here. On my terms, and yes, finally, in a way that feels like justice without needing anyone's permission to call it that.